And we're live.
Hi, Alexis.
Good afternoon, Rachel. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, also very charged up from our practice group today. Thank you so much for your presence and to all of those who joined us.
Yes.
And today's topic is an extension on last week's conversation around depression. And today we'd like to discuss the art of letting go. How do we support ourselves during times of parting, whether that's parting with a friend or family member that we may have lost, but even parting such as moving house, which can be quite a big shift for some people if there's a lot of story, or even changing a career. Again, these things, these transitions do ask us to let go. And as you and I have just been discussing, our culture is not so good at paying attention to and consciously completing. We tend to either try and skip over it or rush it or avoid it even. And so today's discussion is about actually shining the light of awareness on what it is to part and let go, and how can we make that easier for ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Alexis. Because we were talking before we went live about how we all have defended ourselves against the vulnerability of goodbyes and farewells and partings and adjustments that we need to make when things transition and change in life. And how we kind of will maybe do one of at least three things. We may kind of lie to ourselves and others by saying, like if we're moving city, I'll be back, I'll call you, I'll come visit all the time, and then we don't. And we kind of, this is the high school students, right, who say, we'll stay in touch. And then, of course, it doesn't really go that way. Or we may devalue it. We may do the sour grapes thing. And like if we're having a breakup or leaving a job, we may only focus on the negative aspects of that person or that job in order to not cope with feeling doubtful or vulnerable or sad. Or we may just skulk out the back door and we may want to leave without saying goodbye, which I know I have done that in the past myself. So these are all the ways we defend against feeling vulnerable things like sadness and uncertainty.
And what do you think that's about, Rachel? Why do you think collectively we're not good at this? I mean, it's a Western culture thing, it seems. I'm thinking about the gates of the Ganges and how rife with death that experience is. And that having been exposed to that regularly as just a daily happening would certainly change our perspective on letting go.
I think you're onto something there. I once had a Buddhist teacher who mentioned, having lived in India, that he saw women giving birth, he saw people dying. These days a lot of the transitions in life, birth, death, sickness, old age, are very sterilized or clinicalized, if that's a word, behind four walls. We don't get to see it. And I think in our culture we've lost a lot of ritual. A lot of coming together sort of ritual. I mean, we still have funerals and we might have a going away morning tea for somebody who's leaving the workplace, or a farewell party for somebody who's, moving away. So there are some rituals in our culture, but I think there are not as many as there, maybe used to be, or in other more traditional cultures. The culture plays a big part, doesn't it?
It really does. So on a more personal front, what do you think is underneath your tendency, which you so beautifully and honestly acknowledged, to skulk out the back door? May I ask, what do you feel? What do you feel that comes up for you when there's that pull to skulk away?
Well, I understand it now, and I didn't understand it then. I think it's an avoidance of sitting in the vulnerability of the parting, of the farewell, and the truth of, I'm thinking of situations in my life where the truth was, I may not see you again, or I don't know when I'll see you again. And I think I wasn't able at earlier ages to claim the love, because love and gratitude are very vulnerable states as much as sadness, because both of them break us open. Sadness breaks our heart open, but so does love and joy. And I didn't have that really strongly role modeled in my family of origin or by this culture. So it's like, well, I don't really know how to handle these feelings of vulnerability. And I'm still getting a bit hot under the collar and feeling a bit self-conscious now. So I'm just going to quietly leave now, and hopefully nobody will see me. I've definitely done that, especially as a teenager and a young adult, I remember.
So this is interesting because it taps into something we discussed a while back around our capacity for joy and love as much as for the pain. And that's, we talk a lot about expanding our capacity for pain, and yet we can only expand in that direction as much as that direction. And I can absolutely relate to that, that there's a fear of claiming the real beauty. There's a fear of really acknowledging how much love and light and joy is contained in some experience, whether it's in relationship, and let's be honest, it's all some form of relationship, whether it's with a person or a place or a context of some sort. Yes. So to really honor that, the beauty of it kind of heightens the sadness and the grief, and yet we're building capacity. I find myself doing this a lot in our discussions.
It's making me think of a woman I know who I still know, and I think she follows this Facebook page, so she may be watching. And I met her in my playgroup 17 years ago when my oldest was a baby. And she would cry really, I've told her this, so I'm not speaking out of school. She would cry really easily, and beautiful things would make her cry. She's the sort of woman who'd cry at a wedding, as well as a funeral. And I really admired her emotionality. She was a smart woman and got a lot of things done, and yet she would tear up so easily. And at that time, I was much more stoic and much more in my intellect and doing my PhD. And I was sort of like, on the one hand, why does this woman cry so much? And on the other hand, I wish I could cry that much.
Yes. Well, it does. I've found through my practices with you in compassionate embracing that it helps me to find my center and my point of stability as I expand my capacity for these feelings. So I love what you've raised about claiming the value of what is being lost in the process of parting. And that brings us back to ritual, which does help us to reflect on the beauty as much as help us to make sense of change. And because change is an essential part of the process of parting too.
And it's making, just to kind of ground this in clinical practice just for a moment, I don't want to stay here, but there is something in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, called adjustment disorder. And adjustment disorder has a few characteristics. One is the person's gone through a significant life transition or change or adjustment or loss, and that 6 months or more needed to have passed, and the person is still having a great deal of difficulty functioning. They may be experiencing heightened anxiety and or depression as a result of sort of not having moved through the change process. It could be a job loss, it could be a relationship breakup, or a move or something else, and they haven't been able to complete the process. They haven't been able to let go. Part of them is still holding on, and then they're suffering as a result. And whenever I've sat with people who've had this diagnosis, it's really I mean, in a way, we've all had adjustment disorder to some degree, right?
Yeah, nice to acknowledge.
We've
Yes.
all had difficulty adjusting to big, hard things. You know, like I always say to people, look, everybody's had an adjustment disorder, even if it was mild. You know? It's like having a cold. Everybody's had a cold. So, but, you know, it's because there's so much going on in the psyche when we're trying to process it all intellectually and emotionally and socially and spiritually. And there is such a process of making sense of what's happened, ritualizing the change, ritualizing the process and letting go. And I just want to not forget that we had 2 questions this morning on the Facebook page about letting go and also about aging and losing friends and loved ones as you get older. So maybe this is a good time to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of my parents, who are baby boomers. And, you know, our family dinners these days that usually involve them sharing with me that, a family friend has passed.
Yeah.
And I really pay attention to them when they share this news, because at some level they're making sense of their own mortality. In fact, we're all of us sitting around the dinner table are making sense of our own mortality and the loss of our loved ones. The loss of our parents, which is got to be one of the hardest.
It's huge. It's so much comes up for us with that one. And it's just occurring to me, so I'm going to share it, that every time, many of us probably transitioned from, one house to another, one school to another, out of school, from childhood into adolescence, from adolescence into adulthood. Like every single person, they live long enough, has these farewells, these goodbyes to stage life, as well as people and places. Now, the thing that I find as a psychologist, the thing I find in myself as a human being is there probably will be parts of my story, of my development, where I did not fully process that goodbye, that adjustment, that change. And if I haven't fully digested it, if I haven't fully let go, there's still some emotion around it somewhere at some level in me. And that may get activated the next time I have a letting go process.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It sort of accumulates over the years. And so as we get older, it may open us up even more to more emotion and more vulnerability, because we've got some remnants from the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a kind of an accumulation of what we're holding and not looking at. Again, it reminds me of shadow, those aspects that we suppress and place in the unconscious or don't want to know about, that ultimately burden us and ultimately can lead to harm, which, my experience of parting is that the more I can allow for the hurt and the joy, the more I can allow for both of those experiences, the less I'm inclined to want to react or cause harm, be destructive in some way. So this process of change, I think, is really pertinent, and processing. I like that you use that word, processing. It feels very sensory to me, and just reminds me of the body scan that we do in Vipassana meditation or Shavasana at the end of yoga, that we're making sense of change quite experientially. And that can facilitate the letting go.
And there's so many ways, there's so many sources of support or methodologies that we can draw on in our processing, right?
Yes.
And so I'd love to ask our audience, what sorts of things have helped you to let go when you've been in some sort of change of the seasons of your life, whatever that means, whether it's a person, a place, or a stage of your life. What's helped you let go? Have you used rituals? Have you had what we call in psychology transitional objects to help you?
Who is this?
Children.
Transitional object.
I don't know this Teddy's name, unfortunately. This is my youngest daughter's Teddy. He's a bit abandoned these days, poor Teddy. But in Jungian psychology, they call a blanket or a teddy for a child a transitional object. You take the teddy to grandma's place, or when you move house or go to a foreign country or city, the teddy stays the same, it stays with you. But adults, we have our transitional objects. Sometimes our iPhones are our transitional object. People get quite attached to their phones. And this is normal psychology, So what have you used to help you let go or transition? How do you ritualize this? How do you process your feelings?
This will be helpful because I know you have you have lots of personal stories around this, but you actually have a bit of a letting go process coming up professionally. I might ask that question. I can check the questions if you'd like to ponder, just particularly around this transitional objects. I know that you were considering some symbol that you might share with your clients while you're on leave. And whether you've had any thoughts around that, particularly in relation to this dear teddy and these transitional objects, because a symbol can be incredibly powerful and grounding.
It can be. It absolutely. I mean, this is why people get tattoos or get attached to certain items of clothing or music. We're very hardwired to find our attachments to certain things comforting. So what you're referring to is that I am soon taking around 3 months leave. So it's not like I'm leaving my role as a therapist or leaving my practice or leaving town, but even taking 3 or 4 months away from client work, I'm feeling it in my system as a sort of I'll lose my structure and my footing and my work I love doing. And my clients, some of them are feeling a little bit wobbly about me kind of being away for this time. So I was actually thinking of, going and buying a cheap pack of some, I haven't looked yet, but, just some small item as a gift to say, look, this is, a representation of our work together, I put it somewhere as a visual anchor just to kind of remind you of what we've done and that I'll be back, So I'm still thinking on that, but I wonder if there are any comments, Alexis, in our...
Yes, there are. So Mia says that partings are like milestones. Saying goodbye can be a milestone, and sometimes we don't take time to relish. That's a great word in relation to partings. I only realised recently after one of these, I've never stopped and processed or even acknowledged any of these milestones until now. And that's a beautiful reminder, Mia. That reminds me that we do have some rituals around the process of letting go in our culture, such as, well, my son's about to graduate from primary school, and that's quite a big deal. And there is certainly a sense of closure around that there's an acknowledgement. The school do a beautiful job of bringing up all the kids' photos from when they were little preppies, and we get to see the whole cohort, how they've grown and developed. And there's a definite honouring and a joy and a sweet sadness, a bitterness. It's sweet and sad. So there are milestones. Even Christmas can be a milestone for a lot of people.
And I think sometimes it's such a good point that sometimes we don't relish it because there's a poignancy, when children leave their school or when we, any kind of goodbye. There's a poignancy there that is, as you say, both sweet in the deep valuing of what we've had and so kind of, it's bittersweet, isn't it? It's so painful too. I mean, sometimes it's just bitter. Sometimes, we're just getting out of a bad situation and it's hard to find sweetness. But I guess what you're talking about is the bittersweet and the poignancy of that. It kind of should fill us with awe. Once upon a time, awe, the word awful was like awe-filled, and people in, like, the culture was different, I believe, 50 to 100 years ago, where we still, when we're a more religious culture, we still made time for the awe of a situation to be, like to just behold the awe of the situation. Like we still say that's awesome, but maybe it's awe-filled, you know, like, wow, look what this is. Look what has happened. Definitely holding space to relish that, as she said. I think we're frightened to do that sometimes because we will feel so many feelings.
Well, that's right. And there's another comment there about pets being transitional objects, but also you and I have had discussions about the loss of a pet, and that can be a very triggering experience. And there's something quite interesting in the differentiation between the loss of a pet, because you wouldn't devalue. There'd be no need to devalue the pet. You might diminish the relationship to try and ease your suffering. But it's quite different to the loss of a relationship. And I think this really fascinates me, this area. I do see that in our culture, ending of romantic relationships is seen in a negative light. Rarely is it seen to be a constructive, positive, empowering decision.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody says, gee, I hope that relationship kind of made you bigger in some way, and that you're going to take all of the juice from that and really take it forward, and you know that you're a bigger, better person for it. People don't really say that.
No, they say I'm sorry as though someone's died, which is interesting. But the differentiation I'm noticing now as we're talking is that there is a tendency to put that person, a previous partner or a lover, in a negative light. As one of my teachers is a beautiful psychotherapist, Catherine Woodward Thomas. She's the founder of Conscious Uncoupling. She talks about that all too often soulmates suddenly become soul hates, and this as you mentioned earlier, devaluing or denying the beauty. But it's interesting that so often plays out in romantic relationships, perhaps because the grief is just so vast and often affects, circles of friends, circles of family. But just interesting that the association with a pet doesn't go there. And I have heard it said that a pet relationship is kind of a very ideal form of a secure attachment. I mean, I'm yet to really decide whether that is true, but I just think it's interesting, why we have such a clean relationship with pets in a way.
I think it's because of language. We don't communicate with we do communicate with our pets through language, but they don't communicate back through human language, only through pet language. But when we're in a relationship with another person, a whole lot of narratives and a whole lot of stories and perceptions and judgments and blame, criticisms and labels, all of that comes into it over time. And in the beginning, it could be all romanticized, idealized, and then later all kind of very devaluing, as you said. But this might be a good time to differentiate between suffering and all the suffering that our mind can give us through the stories, and just natural pain. This difference between pain and suffering. Would it be okay if I read a little quote from my dear teacher who died only a week ago?
Yes.
About this?
Yes.
So, and maybe you can check the comments, please, Alexis.
Absolutely.
So it's quite a long reading, so I might put it in the comments, the whole reading, but I'll just read you a little bit of it. Where he says, when we move fully into sadness, and the sadness touches what is precious and beautiful in our hearts, this kind of sadness is sweet pain. There's a beautiful pain around it that is not constricted. It is tender and relaxing. When we get in touch with pure sadness, there's a sinking into it, a settling, a relaxation. This is natural pain. And the last paragraph says, until we arrive in the place where we hold pain and joy as equally valuable, we are resisting life in some way. We are resisting being fully present in any moment in the fullness of our heart. If we want joy more than pain, there is resistance.
Mm.
So he talks about being fully present to life as it is, all of the experiences, pain and joy, and inhabiting this state of presence, being seated in the heart.
Mm. Yes, I think that's fascinating. There's so much talk about the heart, because the feeling as you were reading that was very much in the heart, and the softening into it is physically very helpful and emotionally. So there's been a few more comments. To what extent can you talk about the link between the loss of significant elements like work and relationships and the coinciding loss of identity? So, yeah, the loss of work or relationship and loss of identity. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I would love to say something about that. I might just quickly explain the 3-circle model of the self. So anyone who was on our last retreat would have seen this on the whiteboard, and it stayed there for the entire retreat. And in the middle circle, the concentric circles, the center one was our essential self, our core being. It wasn't our identity, not our ego, but where our needs and values and our life force resides. And then out of the experiences of not having our needs met, of not being seen and supported, and of not being able to live by our values, we experience shock and pain and disappointment and vulnerability and overwhelm. In this second circle, we've got pain, a vulnerable pain. And because it's hard to stay with vulnerable pain unless we have a witness or some inner resources to support us to stay with our own vulnerability, our own pain, the mind, the psyche, will go to its defenses. Now, one of its defenses, and there's nothing wrong with defenses, by the way, anything that's trying to defend or protect us can't be bad. So we must honor these defenses, and they teach us a lot. Our defenses teach us so much, but one of our defenses is our identity. And you can feel it. Like when I get a little bit inflated in my, I've got this education and I'm a psychologist. It's a protective mechanism, like make no mistake, right? And for all of us, our role as a worker or a professional or as a mother or a father, or even the identification with a diagnosis, I've seen this in my work, an over-identification with anything.
Interesting.
A defense mechanism. It's in this outer circle of protective structures of the psyche, along with avoidance, aggression, dissociation, and numbing. All the judgments and the blame and the projections and all of this stuff that teaches us so much about ourselves. So when we lose our identity, when we lose our job or our marriage, and our identity is in such a state of flux, make no mistake, that is, like the mud at the bottom of the water has been stirred right up, and we will suffer. Like none of us is enlightened enough to not suffer. We suffer. Our mind goes all over the place to all kinds of thoughts. We devalue ourselves, and then we devalue the other, and then we come back to devaluing ourselves again. My suggestion is slowing down and observing, always observing, like what's going on, and trying your best to feel the raw feelings. And this is where NVC is such a great practice, because it differentiates the stories. We observe the mind, and then we try and get as close as we can to the direct feeling and emotional experience in the body. This is what the quote was about: going into the heart, being with the pain, with less of the story. And this is not easy, as we know. We have tricky minds. Our tricky minds will pull us back into the past and the future stories. So any help we can get from a practice buddy, a therapist, a coach, through meditation, through journaling, these are some suggestions.
Yes, there was even a comment, Rachel, that your reading was very relaxing to hear. And I certainly experienced that too. In fact,
Good.
any reminder to come into the body provides relief, even if there is, as you say, those wellings of grief and sadness. There's still some sense of relief. There was that the oppression of thought. That was a quote that you read today. A relief from the oppression of thought when I drop into the body, and the raw feeling. I resonate with that word. Feelings are very raw. I feel like you think of tenderizing meat. We are meat. We are flesh. And that tender, raw feeling is vulnerability to me.
And be very gentle with yourself, Stephen, and everybody, because the nature of the mind is so amazing and so difficult and tricky at the same time. The mind will pull you out of the rawness, the tenderness, because, there's a part of our mind, the survival part, that says, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to feel so shaky, so vulnerable, so awkward, so much pain, and so we just need to be gentle with ourselves, and we can titrate this. We can come out of it and we can go back to it. We can gently, there's a rhythm we can apply here. We don't have to, be masochistic about this or beat up on ourselves. It's okay to vacillate between sitting with yourself in that direct, raw experience, and then, doing your best is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, absolutely. Again, so many of our conversations return to compassion as a cure-all. Compassion for self allows me to move through any experience. If I can just hold myself compassionately, then I'm not resisting. And as you were talking, that was my experience of the reading. It's a reminder to soften towards the feeling.
Yes. And it's softening is a great word. Sometimes that will be in the instruction that I give myself, just to soften, to slow down, and then to soften again. And acknowledging if you're feeling constricted, if you're feeling hard and tight, also kind of observe that. Like, I've had many dyads in NVC retreats and other kind of practice partnerships where I or the other person has said, I'm really in my head right now. My thoughts are racing. I'm having trouble getting in touch with the deeper feelings. And that's just where they're at. And this is for me where I journal. If my mind is racing, if I'm over analyzing, trying to solve everything and figure everything out, I personally find journaling gets a lot of those thoughts out. In the process, it helps me touch into some feelings. It helps me let go of some thoughts, maybe make sense of things a bit better. So that's what I do. I journal.
As you're talking, it reminds me also of as that image of the meat that I spoke about being tender and soft. We know that allows for circulation. So our muscles are just like that flesh, and whether we harden and block and try and protect, or whether we soften and allow the full flushing of circulation, oxygen, creates a very different physiological experience. Just like exercise, pushing and attending and moving towards, and just like the breath, we breathe into a body part, that these physical practices can create quite a different experience around where we localize pain or resistance. And I'm quite confident, and we know very much that inflammation is the cause of most chronic illness, and inflammation is absolutely exacerbated by this lack of circulation. So my sense is, if we resist the completion, if we don't fulfill the cycle of full fruition, if we miss those essential, beautiful parts of letting go, that in some way we are hardened. There it is. We are hardened, and somehow we're causing dis-ease.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, we tighten up. And I think most of us have done that at least once or possibly many times in our lives when we didn't know what else to do. This is survival stuff, right? And we didn't know what else to do. So our body did tighten and it did tense around and it braced itself to protect itself from the next thing. And we didn't have a trustworthy witness there, a skillful, resourced other person to help us, you know. So probably most of us have sort of unconscious and unresolved tensions from and pain from the past. And I just wanted to say, there's not only is there no shame in that, like there's so much juice and learning to be gained from bringing curiosity to looking kind of going back and looking at your own experiences. I'll bring it back to this focus of farewells, goodbyes, adjustments, and partings. You know, if there have been times in your life where you think, I didn't really grieve that properly. I've had people grieving things in my office that and they say, this was 40 years ago and I'm grieving it now. Like, that's a thing that happens, and that's totally okay.
Yes, it reminds me that how we let go is ultimately how we will let go of our last breath. And I have no evidence for this. I haven't let go of my last breath, obviously, but it makes sense that we're experiencing closure, completion, resolution, death, letting go in every moment. We are letting go of the past, and how well we can process and allow for that fullness and completion. It makes sense that would translate ultimately to how we let go and grieve our own lives. I mean, that is quite fascinating too. And it also reminds me that every time we part, it is in a way a preparation for this powerful event that is to come.
For all of us.
For all of us, that's right.
Life ends, everything ends, and even now we're all moving towards some kind of ending or another, whether it's, you know, the ending of this video, which we should do shortly, or the end of the week, or the end of this role that I'm in now and the transition to the next, or nothing lasts forever. The Buddhists talk about this a lot. Mia has asked, oh, hang on, I've lost the page. Someone has asked, I think it was Mia. So how do we complete the cycle? So Mia, because we're out of time, I'd like to suggest having a look at last week's video where we spoke about the cycles or phases of grief, because the grief process involves a variety of emotions and cognitions. And, it really is worth journaling, speaking about, feeling into and ritualizing the various emotions that are part of the cycle. And there was one other thing I wanted to say about this, and I think having the right attitude also helps, because we need a bit of a counterculture attitude, just to kind of come back to what we started with. The attitude in our culture is, sadness is terrible, and when things end, as you said, Alexis, people say, I'm so sorry. Whereas everything ends. Endings are the necessary condition for beginnings and for life. And teach us about our own resiliency and our own independence and our own ability to rely on ourselves as well as others. And so I think if we kind of remember that all processes come to an end, and then kind of bring that attitude, that helps us kind of stay in the cycle, keep going, and get some sense of completion with the right attitude, if I could say it that way.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful summary, Rachel. In fact, it answers many of the questions tonight around, the difficulty letting go and the resistance as if we've identified or we're overly reliant, and that the process of letting go is a claiming not only of the beauty of what has been, but a claiming of independence and my true self, who it is that I really am. I'm not this aspect that has gone. What I am is much more.
much more bigger, more expanded. Yeah, like the child going to adolescence, the adolescence going to adulthood, and all the stages of human development where hopefully we keep growing. Growth is painful sometimes, as we know. There's one more excellent question from Lee Condon, and it's making me think, how do you feel about this, Alexis?
Yes.
A topic I'd love to touch on next Sunday, live at 5, that relates to Lee's comment is jealousy and envy. How do you feel about that topic?
That sounds very interesting and quite stirring. I think we could, yeah, a bit of shadow in there. Oh, okay. Already you've got my mind thinking.
Because she mentions degrading the perceived successes of those we compare ourselves to. So in envy and jealousy, there is some overvaluing, devaluing, and comparison stuff that's going on. And I'd love to dive into that next week.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Thank you for your comments. It's a joy you inspire us to do what we do. Dr. Rachel, thank you as always for sharing your experience and your wisdom and your beautiful use of language. I take so much away from these conversations. So already excited and looking forward to next Sunday. I'll see you then.
Next Sunday on Facebook, and then the following one, if you can make it to our workshop, which is around the spirituality of compassion. I'll put a link in the comments below.
Yes, that's going to be quite a special one, our last one for the year, and perfect to get you in the right frame for Christmas and family and social time. So yes, we'd love to join you. Please jump on board.
Good. So till next time.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Bye. Everybody. Bye.